Welcome to the Ubuntu Server series. In this nugget, we're going to talk about installation. And specifically, we're going to talk about installation as it pertains to Ubuntu. In the world of installations with Linux, there's a ton of stuff we could talk about, but I want to focus specifically on those things that are Ubuntu-y, or Ubuntu-ish, or Ubuntu askew. Anyway, let's get down to business and talk about Ubuntu installation. Alright, in my big messy spaghetti looking slide here, we're going to talk about different things to do with installation. First of all, installation methods. Now, Ubuntu comes with a bunch of different ways to install it, and a lot of this comes from its Debian roots. Remember, Ubuntu is derived from, or I guess maybe the arrow should be going that way. Whatever. Anyway, Debian has a lot of installation options, and so Ubuntu has a lot as well, but some things are unique about Ubuntu installations. For example, right now you can still download a CD image and burn it to disk and install from that CD image if your computer has a CD drive. I put the little asterisk here though because now some of the versions of Ubuntu, like Xubuntu, the ISO image is actually too big to burn on a CD. So you either have to use a DVD or use another installation method. It seems like the CD itself is becoming less and less common. In fact, a lot of computers don't even have CD drives anymore. One of the more common ways to install it is with USB. Now, we're going to actually look how to do that because with USB you come up with a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario because in order to create a USB installer with the Startup Disk Creator, you have to have Ubuntu installed. So on an Ubuntu machine, you can create an Ubuntu installation USB stick. However, if you don't have it installed, you see the chicken and an egg thing. So we're actually going to look at a tool called UNetBootin, which is a really bizarre name, I'm not going to lie to you. But this is a neat tool, and this isn't specific to Ubuntu, and it doesn't actually come from Ubuntu. This is a third-party tool, but it's vital to create a USB bootable installation media. So we're going to show how to do this in Windows because that's one of the more common places. If somebody has a Windows box, you can make an Ubuntu USB installer without having Ubuntu previously installed. So this is more common actually than the Startup Disk Creator, even though the Startup Disk Creator in Ubuntu is very powerful and works very well. All right. There's also, you can install over the network. There's a couple ways to do this even. We're actually going to use the net install or the net install ISO. This is a very tiny ISO image. You can burn it to a CD or you can put it on a USB drive and install directly from a repository. The advantage of this is, well, one, it's less to download. You know, the ISO is like 30 megabytes. But the advantage of when it's installed is that you get the most recent version installed without updating because you're pulling it directly from the repo. We are actually going to do this. This is how we're going to install it. It's a really neat way. It's something that you don't see very often. There's also, this is not specific to Ubuntu. In fact, Ubuntu doesn't support it as well as something like CentOS or the crimson colored head covering distribution that you've probably heard of that CentOS is based on. They use Kickstart. Ubuntu also uses Kickstart, and basically what that means is you can boot directly off the network, and this sets up a pre-configured script for doing all the installation options that you want to do. This is kind of a lengthy process. I'm not going to go into this in this nugget. Just know that Ubuntu does support Kickstart. I mentioned it in like my Real World Linux series, you know, more in depth on how to do this. This is not specific to Ubuntu, but Ubuntu does support it. We're going to look at net install, but first I want to take you to Windows, which is very uncommon for me, and we are going to create something inside Windows to install Ubuntu. So let's go to my Windows machine really quickly. Okay, here we are. I'm in the unfamiliar territory of Windows, but I need to open up a browser, and we actually need to get two different things. The first thing we need to do is get an Ubuntu ISO image, right? So we can go to ubuntu.com or .org, and we can say server, download Ubuntu server, and then we can actually get Ubuntu from here. I'm actually going to use a local mirror just because it'll download quicker. This will not work for you most likely. This is internal on my network, but I have my own mirror of Ubuntu and CentOS because I'm really nerdy like that. So I'm going to go into the releases folder. I am going to download the server install CD. I'm going to get the 64-bit version. And it should download very quickly. The other thing we need to do is get unetbootin. Again, a really strange name, but we'll search for it and go to their homepage. Now this is available for Windows, Linux, and OS X. We're actually on Windows, so we're going to get the Windows version. I'm going to say save it. Alright, everything is complete. So we're going to close this. And now, let's see, I'm not familiar with Windows. We'll go into here. My downloads folder, now we have two different things. We have the unetbootin executable. And this is actually kind of a cool program. You can decide any Linux distribution it supports, and there's a bunch of them. Ubuntu, and pick the one of the versions here. You can get that. You can create a net install USB. We're actually going to use a net install ISO that we're going to download in a few minutes to do our install. But you can download stuff from here. You'll notice there's actually not a server version of this here, and that's fine. You don't have to actually have it downloaded anyway because we've already downloaded it. So we're going to choose an ISO image, right? Disk image ISO. We're going to find it. It's in our downloads folder right here. And now you'll see I don't have a USB drive in. So let me install, or let me plug in a USB drive. Okay, so now I've installed the USB drive. Actually, I'm probably going to have to restart this program. There. Okay, see, it's detected my USB drive as E. I'm going to select my ISO file again, that one that we downloaded. And then it's just a matter of clicking OK. It's going to go through and install and create a bootable USB drive that will allow us to install that ISO that we've downloaded. It'll allow us to install it right off of the USB drive. It says not responding. See, I don't like Windows. This is just as it's writing to the USB drive. It's not as responsive as it could be, but it's going to finish this process. It takes quite a while. I have a 1 gigabyte flash drive. You need something at least a gigabyte in size because a CD image is like 700 and some megabytes. So you have to make sure you have at least a 1 gigabyte file or 1 gigabyte flash drive, and it will go through and create a bootable drive. We're going to just let this go in the background because we're going to install with a different method. But you need to know, if you're in Windows or in OS X, once you create this file with unetbootin and allow it to go through its entire process, you can then boot your system from that USB drive, and it'll act just as if it were a CD that you've booted from. Again, it's a really slick way to install Linux if you don't already have Linux installed, because with Linux installed, you could use its own USB creation tool, but we don't have that. So this is unetbootin in Windows, and you got to see Sean Powers use Windows. It's not a terribly common occurrence. All right. So what we're going to talk about now is net install. What net install does, this is a small ISO image. You download the small ISO image, and you can, like you said, like you just saw, you can actually create a unetbootin USB drive with net install, or you can use an ISO, create a CD, or what we're going to do is actually use the downloaded ISO file in our virtual server environment, like in our VMware environment, so that we can install with net install. And this has boot code, so it has a kernel on the CD that will allow us to boot from. And that's about it. And it has enough to get the network going so that we can finish the install over the network. So let's see how that works on our virtual machine. Well, first things first, this is still doing its thing, but we're going to open up a browser. Might as well use Windows, right? And we're going to look for Ubuntu 12.04 net install. So search for this, and we're going to come up with this. It's the installation or minimal CD. Okay, that's what they call it, the minimal CD or net install. And basically, since all we get is boot code and enough to bring up the networking, there is no desktop or server or alternate CD to choose from. All we get to choose is 64-bit or 32-bit and what version. And then we get to decide during the install what version we want to install. So we're going to go with 64-bit. We're going to go with 1204 because this is, again, the LTS version. So we're going to download this ISO. It's only 30 megabytes. See? So it's a very small ISO image, and I'm going to leave it to you to figure out how to burn that onto a CD, or if you want to use UNetBootin to make a net install, you can do that as well. I'm going to install this downloaded ISO image into an empty virtual machine container and boot from it so we can watch the process happen. Okay? Okay, I've powered up our virtual machine and told it to boot from that mini.iso file. So it's as if I burned it to a CD and I booted the computer from the CD. And we get presented with this menu. And we're just going to do install. It's going to be command line, even though it doesn't think it's going to be. The only option we have here is to install, and so we're going to do that. Now, I should warn you that for the installation process, we're going to have the shrunken down screen that you see here, only because that's the default resolution, and I can't change that during the installation process. So we're stuck with, I think this is an 800 by 600 screen. All right, so we start the process like a normal text-based installation. If you've done any installing of Linux, so I chose English, United States, that's where I am. We can tell it, no, I don't need to detect the keyboard. I'm not sure what it would do if we just, so then we just have to tell it what kind of keyboard, and mine is English US. Keyboard layout is English US. If you're in the US, pretty much you can just hit enter through most of these as the default. And now it is going to bring up our network. Remember I said all it has is the kernel that will allow us to boot and enough stuff to get the network going. And it detected my network, it got me going. It says pick a host name. Now let's say Ubuntu's fine. We'll say Ubuntu server. Okay, click continue. Now here's key. What's going on here? Now again, we could just hit enter by default and it'll find a local mirror for us in the US where I'm located. It actually picked US because of my IP address and my geographic location. But if you happen to have a local mirror, like I do, you can select your own, okay? But normally we would just do United States, I'd enter, and it would select for us, one that's local. Well, I'm actually going to go all the way to the top and say enter information manually. You don't have to do this, but you can if you happen to have a mirror. Remember what my address was? It was mirror.nuggetlab.com. And just the host name here. By default, and you notice, maybe you didn't notice, but my mirror actually has a folder called Ubuntu. That's where the repository defaults to, and I just left my mirror the default, so we're going to leave that. And then, now this process will take a while to install, especially if you're installing off the internet. So if you're installing off the internet, you still get the advantage of getting the absolute latest files and the latest versions of everything installed from the get-go. And you also don't have to burn an entirely huge CD. However, it does take a while to install. If you're installing from a local mirror, it goes much faster, but even still, it takes a while. Basically, all that time you would spend downloading the big ISO image, you're now spending downloading the individual files that you would need. However, you're not going to download files that you don't need. The ISO comes just chock full of stuff, and you don't need all of it. So we'll let this go through the installation process, and I'll fast forward a little bit through some of the slow parts. Okay, it's getting ready to, we'll say a new user. I'm going to use my own username, full name, Sean Powers, S Powers, a password, encrypt my home directory. Now you can do encryption right here, right, from the get-go. You can do encryption on your drive, on your home directory. I'm going to say no. But it is an option to set up during the installation process, which is kind of cool. It detected my time zone. We'll say that's correct. And so now, here is, remember in the last nugget we talked about the different partitioning schemes? Well, this is where we can do some of that stuff. So basically, we have a few options. We have guided, and then use the entire disk, We have guided use the entire disk and set up LVM, logical volume management. Or guided use the entire disk and set up encrypted LVM. If encryption is important in your situation, this is the time when you would do it. With great power comes great responsibility, though. If it's encrypted, it's important that you know the password so that you can unencrypt it. We're going to go, if you say guided use entire disk, it's going to use just one root partition, and it's going to set up a swap partition, and that's going to be it. Okay, so if you set up the entire disk and use LVM, it's going to do everything automatically and create a volume group for you. Now we're going to go in and say manual, and I just want to show you some of the things that you can do. So here's what's already on the disk. These are already here. I'm actually just installing over our computer. So if we want to start from scratch, what we can do is hit enter and say delete this partition. And then we can go down here, hit enter. We'll say delete this partition. And so now we have 21.5 gigabytes of free space. So we can do guided partitioning, or we can configure software RAID. Before we configure software RAID, it's going to make us save those deletions of the partitions that we did. So say yes. And now we want to say create an MD device. What kind of RAID device? What level? Remember 1, 0, 5, 6 I didn't mention, but just really quickly, RAID 6 is just like RAID 5, except there's two spares, two drives that have parity, so you can lose up to 2 drives in your array. And RAID 1.0 is RAID 1 and 0 combined. Alright, so let's just say we're going to do RAID 1. Number of active devices, we'll say 2. Now we're going to fail here in a minute because we actually don't have this many devices, right? We don't have this many drives. Number of drives, number of spares, 0. And so now we've chosen to create a RAID array. We must select exactly 2 partitions. And you'll see, uh-oh, we don't have 2 partitions. We only have the 1. So we're not going to be able to do that here. However, what if we had to? Well, we would check them and it would create the array for us right here without needing to go in and using MD, ADM, or any of those tools. It would create the RAID partition right here. Same thing with the logical volume manager. So let's say we set up a RAID device and it was down here. Well, now let's say with those RAID devices or without, we can just use regular hard drives. Now we want to set up logical volume management. All right. So after it's configured, no additional changes. Are we going to keep the current partition? Sure, yes, we'll keep that. Our current LVM configuration, we have 0 everything. We want to create a volume group. Volume group name Bob. What device are we going to put in that new volume group? Well, we do have a device to put in there. SDA, right? The 21.5 gigabyte drive. So we're going to select that, hit continue. And now it says the partitioning scheme has to be written to disk. Are you sure this can't be undone? Danger, Will Robinson. Yes, we'll configure LVM. So now if you look up there, it says right here, free physical volumes. We have 0 physical volumes free. Remember PV? We have none free. We're using our 1 physical volume, and we have 1 volume group. And that volume group is called Bob. I just named it Bob randomly. So we have 1. Logical volumes, we have no logical volumes right now. We just have a storage pool. So we just made our virtual SAN, but we didn't create a volume yet. So we need to create a volume because that's what we're going to use to install. So let's create a logical volume. And what group are we going to create that logical volume in? Well, how about Bob, since that's the only one that we have. Logical volume name, we'll call it Bob's drive. Continue. How big? It by default made it the maximum size of the drive. Let's make this a little bit smaller. And we can use G for gigabytes. Let's say we're going to make it 15 gigabytes. All right, let's display configuration details so we can see exactly what's in there. So does this kind of seem familiar for the stuff that we were doing in the last nugget on the command line, looking at what's going on behind the scenes? This is a much easier way to configure it, wouldn't you agree? Because we've already done all that same stuff. We even get a nice little summary screen here. So the volume group we created is Bob. We know that it only has one physical volume in it, right? It uses this physical volume that it created and made the proper, it already made the proper partition and the proper partition type. We provide one logical volume called Bob's drive that's 15 gigabytes long, right? And so there's still some storage left in our volume group, which we could use at some other time. So we'll click continue. All right, and now we're finished. We have a logical volume. That's what we're going to use to install on, so we'll say finish. So now, okay, this is what we have. We're back to what partitions are we going to put where, okay? So we have this LVM Bob's drive, 15 gigs. See, does that make sense? We just made that. So now it sees this as a drive. Now down here, it says this is our physical drive, but it's full, right? We can't use this one because we've already created a logical volume, LVM. A logical volume manager is using this drive, so we can't install on this drive. But we have this logical volume managed Bob's drive on the Bob volume group. This is starting to get confusing. I apologize there. But we have this available, right? This Bob's drive logical volume is available. We're going to hit enter, and we get to decide what we're going to use it as. Well, hit enter. We're going to format it ext4. Okay? So ext4, we'll say the mount point is going to be the root file system. And that's about it. Done setting up the partition. Okay, so now we have the root partition set up. It's going to be formatted ext4. It's going to be on that logical volume called Bob's drive. And now, if you're scratching your chin saying, Sean, but what about some swap space? We didn't set up any swap space. Well, you're right. Well, what could we do? Well, we have the flexibility of this logical volume manager going on. So why don't we create ourselves from our volume group? Yes, we'll save changes. So why don't we create a logical volume on the Bob volume group? We're going to call it Bob's swap. How big? Should we fill up the rest of our volume group with our swap partition? Sure, why not? So we'll take the default maximum. We'll say finished. And now, look, we have Bob's swap space, or Bob's swap. Now, it's not already swap. We just called it that, right? That's just the name of our logical volume. So we'll select that. And up here where it says use as, we're going to change this to use as swap area. Done setting up the partition. Bam! So now we have the root drive, we have the swap thing. It's all set up in the LVM, and we never had to touch the command line. It was all done right here. Pretty slick. Okay, so it's all set up. We could, if we had multiple drives, we could have set up RAID using this same configuration tool, right? We looked at that briefly, but we only had one drive. So it's all set up. Finish partitioning. Write changes to disk. Yes. So now it's going to go through and it's going to install the base system. Now this will take a while. So what you're going to see in the next few seconds here is when I'm done talking, we'll zip through the entire install because it's the next part of the install I want you to see. Okay, we get to decide here whether we want to have no automatic updates, install security updates automatically, or manage a system with Landscape. Landscape is a paid service through Canonical, so I'm not going to select that. We can have it install security updates automatically. Automatic updates can be kind of a scary thing, so think about this step when you're doing it. Do you want things to be installed automatically and possibly break your system? Now, security updates are generally safer than general updates, but think through this because you may not want to do that. Alright, and now here is the moment of truth. Now during the net install or the minimal CD installation, remember I said that there is no server version or there is no, it's just you get the minimal CD and you determine bitwise if you want 32-bit or 64-bit, and that's pretty much all you get. And the reason is during the install, right now, during the install part is where you decide what it is you want this installation to be. So basic Ubuntu server is going to just install the basic Ubuntu server system as if we downloaded that CD and installed that. And then we get to decide what sort of server roles do we want. Now, there are some options. If you install from the server CD, you don't get quite this many options as far as roles go, because here we could install, desktop systems. We can install pretty much everything that Ubuntu supports out of the box. But if you use just the server install CD, you only get the server options. So generally what I do, I select basic Ubuntu server and open SSH server. I always want SSH on any server I install. I want SSH installed. Now, you could decide that you want other things installed right from here. If you know that it's going to be a web server, you could install is web server even a thing here? Oh, it would be a LAMP server, right? Linux, Apache, MySQL, and Python or PHP. Okay, so it could be a web server, a DNS server, mail server, OpenStack server, Tomcat server, Samba. If you know the type of server or you want to specify here, you can do that. However, don't worry that if you don't select here, you've shot yourself in the foot and that you can't do it later. You can install any services you want after the system is installed, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say open SSH server just because I always do that. I always want SSH installed, and that's all I'm going to do. All right. If you wanted to install a desktop system, you could uncheck these and actually go through like Ubuntu desktop. I love Ubuntu. That's what that's what we're going to use as our desktop system during this whole series. So that you could check that and it would install the desktop GUI version. But we want to install this. So I'm going to click continue. And now it's going to go through and install that role or those roles on the server. So it's going to be the basic server and OpenSSH. There's not going to be a web server installed. There's not going to be a DNS server installed. We're just going to get the bare bones server with SSH, and that's all that we're going to get on this server. We can install everything else we want later with apt-get. Right? We're not locked in just because we didn't check those boxes during the install. We're going to let this finish up, and then we'll see what system we have, and we'll get done with this installation nugget. Okay, now this is close to the last step that it's going to do. It's installing the bootloader on the hard drive. Now, generally, you just say yes here. Okay, it's going to be the master boot record on the hard drive. It's going to install it. It's going to work perfectly fine almost every single time, and we'll say yes. Remember when I said that in the last nugget that you used to have a boot partition that was small? Well, again, those days are gone. You just say yes, it's going to install it on the master boot record, and we should be good. The only time where you would want to change this is if you're doing like multiple operating systems on your drive, like you're doing a multi-boot kind of thing. Then you may have to worry about where your boot code is going to be stored. But if it's just a server like for this nugget series, just put it on the master boot record. Life is going to be good. Let's see. Is the BIOS set to UTC? I usually say yes there. Installation is complete. Eject the CD-ROM and click continue. So we're going to do that, and it's going to reboot the system into our server. And here we go, first time boot, and then bam, we have our command prompt. Now remember at the very beginning I typed in a username and password. I'll type that, and as long as I type my password correctly, we can log in. We get this cool little information window, and this is now our Ubuntu server. It's installed, it's ready to go, and we're getting close to the end of this nugget. We've installed Ubuntu using one of the more complex ways, using net install, but it's actually one of the more powerful ways. It's one of my favorite ways to install Ubuntu. So let's go back to our slides and make sure we have everything covered, and then we'll move on to our next nugget. Alright, here we are at my even messier than when we started slide, and I just want to make sure we cover a couple things. So we did this. This is what we just did. We did the net install using that minimal CD, and we chose what type of install we wanted. We chose that Ubuntu basic server install, and that's why we didn't get a GUI. We didn't get a graphical user interface. We just got the text, the server-based CLI interface when we were done installing. Okay. One last thing I want to mention is that if you're doing this in a VM, if you decide to install this like in VMware or something, during the installation process, when you select the ISO, like if you use the full ISO image, it's going to say, oh, I detected this as a Linux thing. And it's going to do something it calls easy install. Well, this will work, and it'll work just fine. However, you need to know, or you should know, that if you do the easy install, it's just the very barest of bones install. Okay, it doesn't select any server roles, and you just get a completely bare bones Ubuntu system. So it's important to know that even some of the default things like OpenSSH, none of that will be installed if you do the easy install in your VM system. Okay, it still works, and just like I said, without selecting all the server packages, you can add anything else you want at a later time. It's just important to know that when you do the easy install, you don't get to pick any of those server role things. Okay, so we talked about CDs. USB, this is, a way to create this is with UNetbootin like we did in Windows. I really like the net install, which we just saw. If you're a Kickstart person, like you come from CentOS and you like Kickstart, or you just want to deploy lots of servers, that's the way to go, and Ubuntu does support it. The VMware ISO we just talked about. Okay, so that's installation, and now we get to actually do something on the server in our next nugget. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.